The hepcat subculture emerged in the 1940s jazz scene and gave rise to a widespread fascination with the idea of being hip. What began as a social rebellion has now transformed into a modern-day phenomenon. The evolution of the hipster is an interesting and important progression to examine, and the origins of the hipster provide insight into the far-reaching influence of the 1940s hepcats, beyond their influence on the contemporary hipster. The hepcats began as black bebop jazz musicians in the 1930s and transformed into a white subculture in the 40s as young white men began traveling to black neighborhoods and jazz clubs. The hepcats, also known as white hipsters, emerged in a time when the Depression, both world wars, and rampant racial tension left young liberals in a state of disillusionment. Wanting to disaffiliate from white society, they adopted African American culture. Middle-class white youths rebelled against mainstream white culture, listening to a new, unconventional form of jazz, using cannabis and other drugs, and adopting a more spontaneous, hip lifestyle. It is important to note the hepcats' roots in black culture. Though often overlooked, the hepcats indeed left a resounding impact on race relations in popular culture. In music and other forms of culture, African Americans existed outside the mainstream, often by force. As Norman Mailer claims in his essay The White Negro, this natural independence solidified the black man's central role as a hip figure. Much of hip and its association with black culture was developed around the emergence of bebop jazz in the 1940s. As black jazz musicians grew tired of the whitewashed, commercialized swing jazz, they retreated to their own neighborhoods and began to develop a more complex, introspective form of jazz. They hoped to reclaim their musical creativity without disruption from jazz critics and close-minded white fans. Influential artists like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk became the centerpieces of informal jam sessions that took place after most clubs closed down for the night. They used these after-hours sessions to play freely and experiment with new melodies and techniques. Harlem was the center of this activity, with jazz clubs like Minton's Playhouse and Clark Monroe's Uptown House slowly attracting more and more musicians who hoped to make a contribution to this forming subgenre. As it developed, bebop became an escape from the constraints of a society that constantly subverted African Americans. When bebop jazz moved to Manhattan and grew in prevalence on the famous 52nd Street, it became the basis of identity for white hipsters. Though the swing era had plenty of white fans, it was through bebop jazz and the hepcats that white men first attempted to emulate what they perceived to be the cool and carefree lifestyle of African Americans. Hip, then, became an interaction between black and white. For the first time, popular culture integrated the two races. This is an important development for several reasons. First of all, it opposed the strict segregationist norms within white society. Most white people during this time still believed in the superiority of the white race and practiced direct forms of prejudice. Though this attitude was still prevalent until the 1950s, and the civil rights era was still 2 decades away, the integration the white hipsters achieved was an important first step in building bridges among the races. Unfortunately, despite inherently normalizing race relations to a certain extent, the hepcats' appropriation of black culture did more harm than good for African Americans in society. The fascination with black culture that began with the hepcats actually began a trend of white Americans stealing a distinct culture while giving nothing back to the black community. In the case of the hepcats, they stripped African American jazz musicians of their haven in bebop jazz. Bebop was created so that it could not be imitated by white musicians, and gave African Americans a distinct identity and form of expression in the midst of oppression. Though the musical style was rarely appropriated by white jazz musicians, white bebop fans, especially the hipsters, diluted the importance of the genre by whitewashing its associated style and lifestyle. In the meantime, hipsters allowed continued discrimination against Black Americans. In his book Hip, the History, John Leland described white hipness as a self-serving release from white liberal guilt. Hipsters absolved themselves of direct responsibility for racist attitudes and institutions in 1940s America by claiming to support integration and ignorantly adopting a distinct culture. This appropriation without advocacy is still present in popular culture today, especially within the hip-hop genre. As the name suggests, hip-hop is rooted in hip, and therefore in Black culture. Like bebop, it emerged as a platform to resist the racial power structure in America. Hip-hop, in particular, developed into a form of explicit resistance to discriminatory institutions and images that still existed in post-civil rights America. Many rap and hip-hop artists do accomplish this. However, problems have emerged among commercialized hip-hop artists, and much of this is due to their attempt to appeal to a larger, mostly white consumer market. As Jeffrey Ogbar argues in Hip Hop Revolution, white hip-hop fans are drawn to the exoticism of the Negro. This consumer demand perpetuates the stereotypical depiction of the Black man in hip-hop and other forms of popular culture. In their desperate efforts to achieve hipness, the hepcats of the 1940s created a fascination with the Black man in a way that served to bolster the racial order in America. Now, white rap and hip-hop fans, much like the hepcats did with bebop musicians, glorify the lifestyle of rappers while ignoring or delegitimizing messages of racial oppression and institutional racism. This attitude, invented by the hepcats and adopted by fans of hip-hop, has led to the development of what sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva deems as new racism. Particularly in what many believe is a post-racial America, racism has become much subtler, as personal prejudice declines, but institutions continue to oppress Blacks and other people of color. In place of Jim Crow laws and direct discrimination against African Americans, white mainstream culture ignores and criticizes expressions of dissent among Black Americans, while African Americans continue to experience practices like racial profiling and police violence, redlining, and an overall lower socioeconomic status compared to white Americans. The influence of the hepcats is not only seen then in the obsession with hip-hop culture, but also in the overall lack of acknowledgement among white Americans about the need for racial reform.